In this new show, we will be analyzing the evolution of citizen participation in Spain and Latin America over the last 40 years from the perspective of community movements and social activism. Professors Marta Lora Tamayo and Antonio López will interview María José Aguilar Idáñez, Professor of Social Work and Social Services at the University of Castilla-La Mancha. María José Aguilar will talk about her experience as a social worker in Spain and Latin America. She will highlight specific participatory cases in Brazil, Argentina, and Ecuador, and offer recommendations for conducting these kinds of participatory processes. Plus, she will also discuss other issues of interest to all of you following this series entitled Perspectives on Public Participation. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to UNED yet again. Welcome to the Participatory Group, this community of good practices funded by the Madrid City Council with UNED, where more than 50 cities participate around the world as a network. We hold workshops. You can see them in our website. We have experts of all kinds. We also have these radio shows, these interviews with people who truly show us the good practices of participation and have marked a turning point in the history of participation. Today we are very fortunate, first of all, as always, to have at our side the co-director Marta Lora Tamayo, our most famous professor of administrative science at UNED. Good morning, Marta. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. The administrative staff always covers it. That's how administrative work works. And then we have with us, which is a tremendous blessing, María José Aguilar Idáñez, a professor of social work at the University of Castilla-La Mancha, and a renowned figure who has lived in Latin America for a long time with hundreds of publications and whose work has been translated into many languages. María José, thank you so much for being here and spending some minutes with us. Thank you for thinking of me. What we wanted to ask you today is a very interesting topic because in this project we've interviewed and held workshops with people from Porto Alegre, with people from Buenos Aires about childhood, participatory budgeting, dynamics, but we have always felt that in Latin America, at least in some countries and contexts, they are a step ahead of us in terms of participation in many areas of government. My first question is, tell us a little bit about your background and experience in Latin America. I'll summarize it for you. The first time I went to Latin America, I spent 3 months working in field research and also participating in a community development program in the Dominican Republic. It was in 1980. I visited 5 countries, the Dominican Republic, Puerto Rico, Peru, Ecuador, and Colombia. From that moment on, which was basically a work trip, I was very young. My life changed quite a bit. It's true that I was familiar with it. I had studied sociology. My specialty was in Ibero-American studies as part of my undergraduate degree. But of course, especially at that age, when I was 18, this contact was very important. I've always dedicated myself professionally to accompanying, working with, advising and supporting collective intervention processes, especially at the group and community level. In this, the Latin American experience is extremely important, not only for Spain, the number of things we can learn and should still be learned from the Latin American experience, but also globally. I remember that in 2016, at the Congress of Americanists held in Salamanca, Alain Touraine gave an impressive keynote address on the contributions made throughout history to global social thought. He pointed out that the main concept and the main lessons that Latin America had generated for the world in the field of social thought were the idea of participation and the tools and implementation of participatory processes. How impressive! Since there are people working in this field since the 80s like you, could you tell us how has participation evolved? If you could take a look back, how has participation evolved in Spain and in Latin America? Because I think that in the 80s and 90s they were much more dynamic than we are. In Latin America, as in Spain, I would say globally too, participatory processes in general and social mobilization, collective mobilization, for better living conditions or for the transformation of aspects of social realities have ups and downs. Sometimes you get the feeling that they are cyclical because they are highly conditioned by the context. The social, political and economic context means that there are moments in the history of countries and certain geopolitical regions, perhaps of ebb and flow or of momentum for certain participatory processes. We've experienced this, for example, in Spain during the period known as the famous political transition. It was a period of boom, of mobilization and participatory processes, as was the case during the much shorter period of the 15M movement in Spain. We've also seen it closely related to the 15M movement in terms of the mobilizations of Maghreb and the Middle East, the famous Arab Springs. In Latin America, despite having a much stronger centuries-long historical tradition of collective work, a sense of community and participation, there have also been, from a historical perspective, moments of ebbs and flows, greater growth, greater decline, coinciding perhaps with periods of struggle and mobilization, for instance, for independence, in this case from colonial empires, whether the Portuguese or the Spanish one, mainly in periods coinciding perhaps with anti-imperialistic struggles, and then, for example, more recently, the late 1960s was a time globally, but also in Latin America, of struggles for liberation and social improvements, where incidentally social work played a prominent role, which led to no small amount of persecutions for many academic and professional colleagues, of boom, of great mobilization, and that was followed in the case of Latin America by what has been considered one of the worst and most infamous decades of the continent's history, by a series of dictatorships, the bloodiest in history, especially in the southern part, but not only, which represented a repression and a reflux of all these processes, which then resurface in other contexts. So we have to get rid of the idea that participatory processes are linear, always experiencing the same acceleration. There are moments of faster progress, moments of stagnation, regression, and in the case of Latin America today, there are also variations depending on the country because the contexts are very different. Brazil is not the same as Bolivia or Mexico, but there's one thing I think is important to keep in mind, and that is that beyond these great periods of ebb and flow, the great collective movements and social participation, there's always something that remains in the case of Latin America, which I believe has a lot to do with the tradition of indigenous peoples, communal, collective, self-managed work and mutual aid. These are small experiences, sometimes not as visible, not reported in the newspapers, but which are there and are maintained over time. These experiences have to do with community forms of social solidarity, participation perhaps at a micro level, but which have a significant impact on people's daily lives, from the organization of collective kitchens, communal gardens, experiences of mutual support among women, heads of households, for instance, and in the sphere of the struggle for environmental preservation as well. Thank you for this summary. It's very impressive. All the cases that we have been able to see and analyze respond exactly to what you're telling us in macro terms. We recently held an experts workshop on a land use plan in Notabalo, which was a confluence of this very indigenous tradition, attempting to adapt it to new ways, for example, of regulating cities. All of these cases you've been seeing and analyzing. Out of these, which one would you highlight? Which one has touched mind and heart? Perhaps as an example to follow or as a good practice over all these years, and I'm sure it'll be very difficult to summarize, but is there anything you've taken away from saying this could be replicated, this has truly been a lesson? Well, it's very hard. I've spent many decades working here and I've had many different experiences. Some that are most deeply rooted in my heart haven't exactly been the most successful, but I'm going to try to answer your questions selecting a few things, but I apologize to the audience because, for example, I'm going to try to select one at more macro level and another one at more micro level. For example, at the macro level, because it has a major impact on participatory governance and the sustained citizen solidarity it has fostered, I would cite, for instance, the specific experience that wasn't an isolated event, but a concrete proposal for participatory budgets. Above all, the best known experience has been that of Porto Alegre in Brazil. Porto Alegre is a benchmark not only for Brazil but for Latin America and the world. Not surprisingly, of the 18 global fora that have been held to make a better world possible, 10 have been carried out in Brazil and 7 of these in Porto Alegre. In Porto Alegre, in other words, it's much more than participatory budgets. This is a government initiative with the Workers' Party Major's office in Porto Alegre, which implemented a way of managing the city and distributing the budget based on neighborhood assemblies, truly participatory processes. What happens is that, if you want to draw lessons from this, in some places in Spain, I'm talking for instance about Albacete, which is the closest city to where I live, influenced by the Porto Alegre experience, there was a desire to promote participatory budgets here at a certain point in time. But since there wasn't a full understanding of what participation meant, the participatory budget project was adopted. But here, instead of neighborhood assemblies, and keep in mind that, for example, in Porto Alegre since 1990, which is, I believe, when the first participatory budget saw 1,000 people participating, and by 1999, 40,000 people had already participated directly in decision making. In the case of Albacete and some other Spanish cities, that experience, which has also been called participatory budgeting, bears no comparison with that of Porto Alegre because they've simply entailed the creation of roundtables or small consultations, but without giving all citizens the power to make participatory decisions on the use of the municipal budget and the establishment of priorities. We have one of the relevant projects due to the size of Porto Alegre as a city, which is one of the largest in Brazil, which has expanded to other places in the world, but not always with the same spirit or the same conviction of what it really means to promote a participatory process, which implies that those who have power have to give up part of that power to other people, because otherwise it's false, it's fake. In terms of micro experiences, I have many life experiences, but I would highlight the country where I have spent the longest in Latin America was Argentina. You've mentioned before a project in Otavalo, for instance. Well, the community of Otavalo is one of the communities of indigenous peoples who in Latin America in general and in Ecuador in particular have known how to combine, like few others, everything that has to do with the appreciation of the roots, tradition, knowledge, with technological and scientific modernity. And it would be a great example in all areas if we look at what's being done from Otavalo in Ecuador. But in contrast, I would say that a country like Argentina, which most people think has no indigenous population, it still has some. It's a country where the indigenous population was decimated, not by the Spanish Empire, but by the Creole oligarchy itself after independence. For example, unlike Chile, where the Mapuche people have a certain recognition in the health system and other areas of government, in the case of Argentina, the opposite is true. This is a very small minority, marginalized peoples, and I remember one of the experiences that we were able to financially support from the university, which was in one of the poorest Mapuche communities without any support in the province of Rio Negro. A small project to promote all the artisanal, agricultural and other production that would allow them, through a process of highlighting and developing sustainable tourism, to improve the living conditions of the communities. And I have to say that the initiative for that project came from the tourism guide program at the University of Neuquén, and I was working with them. It wasn't an initiative from other social programs. In that sense, I have to say that in Latin America, universities are also more aware of what university outreach means. Perhaps not as much as in Spain, where it's more about dissemination of cultural activities, promoting socio-cultural outreach activities. But in Latin America, universities also have a commitment to ensuring that everything related to service learning is placed specifically at the service of the most marginalized or disadvantaged communities across all programs, not just social degrees, which is perhaps what we are most accustomed to here in Spain. It's very interesting to listen to you because it places all of our listeners in what the macro view is, and at the same time the details of participatory experiences are highlighted. The truth is that often there's a fatigue, participatory fatigue in Spain, that we also experience when we speak on other projects because of changes in government, because of cycles, which is what you're talking about. It's true that there's an underlying current in Latin America centered around participation, which has had a global impact, as Turen said. On the other hand, we also often observe in administrations here and in many cities this difficulty of management, this fatigue with participatory processes, this kind of results that are achieved and also experiences that fail. So based on your experience, what recommendations would you have to carry out a participatory process with all this background you have from the Latin American experience? What recommendations do you have for our listeners, for those who are concerned? This program is heard not only in Spain, but it's also broadcasted on Radio Nacional de España abroad and is heard by thousands of people. What recommendations or good practices or positive reflections could you share with us about this awareness that participation sometimes addresses issues? Off the top of my head, I'd say briefly, first of all, participation often, many of the frustrations and fatigue you mentioned, occur when the people are most aware, most motivated, or most committed to promoting these participatory processes, and they are confused that participation is a starting point, but they don't see the end point. Participation, achieving people's participation, especially in a sustained manner, not just on a one-off basis, must be viewed as a final destination, a strategic objective to be achieved. Many people get frustrated and disenchanted because they think participatory processes are something that must be achieved from the very beginning, and that's not usually the case. We are not born with an inherent participation chromosome. Quite the opposite. We have been socialized by families, schools, government systems, and the media. We've been socialized to avoid participation, to be competitive and individualistic, and so on. So sometimes we need to shake off certain mental cobwebs and relearn processes that we haven't naturally internalized through our own socialization processes. So first of all, if we want to be realistic and achieve something, we have to stop thinking that participation is something that has to be a given in a process. Participation requires time, it can have ups and downs, it requires a sustained effort over time, and above all, sometimes depending on who promotes or tries to mobilize these processes, sometimes it can be that in the initial moments, the prominence, the energy, or the time that certain promoters or professional agents or volunteers who drive them have to invest in these processes can be greater as the process develops and extends. The prominence of those people who initially promoted the processes has to be reduced, because another of the problems we have, especially in Spain, but not only, is that perhaps at certain times, for example, if I'm talking about neighborhood struggles, neighborhood associations, often the people who have promoted these processes have sort of leveraged themselves in those boards of directors, and over time they end up only representing themselves. So you also have to be generous. Even if you've had a certain role to play at certain moments in the process, and not appropriate it, because that's also a factor that prevents other people from wanting to get involved in the same way. And then, very important too, there's more to say, but to keep things short, I would mention the issue of tools. I told you before, we haven't been socialized to participate, but we haven't been socialized, nor have we naturally incorporated dialogue or nonviolent modes of communication and work. So it's very important to be aware that for a collective group or community process to be participatory, it's not enough to do what used to be decision making by a few people and then suddenly call a referendum or hold a meeting to ask people for their opinion. No, it's very important to have adequate tools that place institutions, professionals, and people in neighborhoods, in cities or towns on a truly equal footing. The asymmetry of knowledge doesn't necessarily translate into an asymmetry of power, because it's necessary to work from structures that are truly egalitarian and that generate trust. We often think we are promoting participatory processes because we use a certain group technique, or because we call an assembly, or because we employ a certain technique, a certain methodology. We need to review, especially from the professional, technical, and institutional perspective, we need to review our implicit models, because we often intend to promote participatory processes, but the way we do things reinforces the status quo, which is certainly not participatory at all. In the case of Spain, we also come from a historical tradition here. The professor of administrative law can perhaps also add to what I'm saying, and where there are very entrenched issues in public administrations that favor approaches that are not very participatory with regards to citizens. I believe our public administrations need greater democratic integration, and perhaps it wouldn't be a bad idea to consider revisiting the institutional architecture so that institutions that now seem to be almost the exclusive reserve of public employees and political leaders can be open to the public. We mustn't be afraid of participation. Participation isn't easy. It requires conviction. Sometimes people talk about participation out of the fact that it's trendy, but just because everybody talks about it and no one is against it doesn't mean everybody interprets it in the same way. I always say, if somebody talks to me about participation, hey, clarify, what do you mean by participation? And then I'll understand what you mean, because even dictatorial regimes have had participatory discourses. We shouldn't confuse apples with oranges. Great, María José, because that wraps it up. I believe it's very funny. It's always enlightening to talk to you. It's very funny because it happens in all environments. Somebody says they want to reach a consensus with you on a proposal, and if you don't do it, if they don't get their way, they get angry. Or someone tells you they want to talk, but in reality it's either what I'm saying, what I want, or I get angry if we don't. So there's that implication that what I say is done with minimal modifications. If I don't, I get angry, which leaves only conflict and resolution through voting in the case of democracies. Of course, it's a shame because you can have different positions and a genuine dialogue goes beyond your position or mine. It's about trying to resolve it. I really like a quote. Aristotle said that doing good makes you feel good. That's the reward of it, not just achieving the goal, but making you better, making the world better. And I believe participation makes you a better person. You recognize others, you manage conflict better, but it's true that a broader participatory culture is needed. Thank you very much for highlighting this. I'd like to tell you that in this field of tools, for example, because it's fairly unknown in Spain, we made an adaptation. All the approaches of Marianelle Slaby in Italy and others regarding consensus building methods, which also work when a greater diversity of opinions and cultural backgrounds are trying to reach agreement, are a very useful tool. We view conflicts more based on negotiation, and we also need to learn to use tools for creative conflict management. Conflicts bring opportunities. We must know how to seize them and capitalize on them. That happens in neighborhood communities. Yes, it happens in universities, everywhere. Someone says, I'm going to make a proposal. Whoever wants to say something, let them say something, and if not, we'll approve it. And then they sent it to you via WhatsApp. You see the proposal, you argue with everyone, you don't say anything. That's it. It's approved. We've reached a consensus. It's not like that. You haven't reached a consensus. You haven't used the tool. that's been thoroughly analyzed and is already known. In other words, how to get what you want without appearing to impose your will, pretending you've participated in a participatory process. That's hypocritical, and I'm very glad you are giving these kinds of examples. Unfortunately, that's what tends to happen most often. If I tell you, Antonio, come on, participate, and I don't even listen to you, or I simply call you to a meeting to say I've called a decent meeting, but my goal is to persuade people in that meeting to do what I've already predetermined should be done. For me, those are forms of pseudo-participation, false participation, and they've been well documented. For true participation to exist, there must be a real decision-making and co-management capacity. María José, what a wonderful lesson. What a masterful ability to convey, to summarize with such passion, such joy, and such an example you are. You've been following a very clear path since you were 18. I think that also defines people's trajectories and their consistency. The fact that your words aren't just mere opinions, but truly a reflection of a very real trajectory. We are following in your footsteps and continuing with these shows, with this series, and we'll invite you again. I think you have much more to contribute. We also have another section featuring expert workshops and roundtables, and I think you are definitely more than welcome to join us because we are eager for so much more. Thank you so much, María José. Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to collaborate with you. Anything you need, here we are.